Welcome to the Great Lakes Horror Company podcast, presented by the Library of the Damned. I am your host, Sephera Giron. Today's theme is sex and slaughter, or as others may call it, erotic horror. Our guests tonight, Nancy Kilpatrick and Megan Hart, have been working in the erotic field, the horror field, and the erotic horror field, as well as other genres for many years. And we all have a ton of books under our belts. Our round table, or rather our triangle tonight, is focused on how you too can be an erotic horror writer. Welcome, Nancy Kilpatrick and Megan Hart. I chose the three of us because I think we represent three generations of erotic horror writers. The world that Nancy first encountered might be different than the world that Megan encountered, as she is the youngest of all of us. Before we begin, I'd like you to introduce yourselves with who you are and some of your erotic horror work. Megan, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm Megan Hart, and I started my writing love with writing short horror, dark fantasy, science fiction. When I started to look into novel-length work, I aimed more toward romance, mostly because I really enjoyed reading romances. And I always liked the romances that kept the door open rather than closed. So I naturally gravitated toward more erotic romance. Fortunately for me, at the time when erotic, more sexually explicit romance was becoming popular, is when I started publishing. But I always loved writing horror as well. So even though my best-known works of erotic romance are not necessarily horror, I always kept in the back of my mind that I loved writing horror and wanted to continue doing it, and I dabbled in it. And I always felt there was a really strong connection between the two genres that I really loved and wanted to explore and just loved writing about. So the projects mostly that I did for fun versus contracted work or whatever kind of always led to the dark places. So that's where I am.
Oh, that's fantastic. Would you like to tell us a couple of titles people might?
Of erotic horror specifically?
Yeah, just to start us off.
The vast body of my published work is either erotic romance or erotica or mainstream romance. There isn't a lot available in erotic horror. One of the reasons being that it's kind of hard to place. I love it. I think all people should love it, but it's kind of hard to find a home for. But I did write a story called Moonlight Madness, and that's available. It's just a very short story, but it is definitely erotic horror versus just horror or erotica. And so that's one title that people could look for if they wanted to.
Great, fantastic. So my answer to the question of who I am and some of my erotic horror work is one of my first pro sales was actually to Nancy Kilpatrick when she was Amarantha Knight. She was editing a couple of anthologies for Masquerade Books. And she lived in Toronto at the time, as did I, and she encouraged me to submit a story to her, which was called Real, which is, of course, the title of a Who song, because all my work is titled after Who songs, even though it's nothing to do with the Who. So that story is called Real, and it was a lesbian ghost story, and it was my first professionally published horror and erotic horror story, and that was very exciting for me, and that was, I think, around 1999 or so. And from there, I proceeded to go on to write horror and erotica and erotic horror and all the combinations thereof. And right now, I'm writing an erotic horror series. I started it a few years ago, and it used to be called the Sextrology series, but now it's called Witch Upon a Star, because there's some psychic out there who's decided she owns the name Sextrology, and I'm not allowed to use it anymore, even though my books are out long before she even existed. But that's another story for another time. And so now my series is called Witch Upon a Star. And the first 4 books have been republished by Riverdale Avenue Books last year. And the next 8 books are going to be published over the next year, with Taurus being the next book coming out in Taurus in May. So that's a little bit of my erotic horror background. Nancy.
Well, I've written quite a bit of horror and I've written quite a bit of erotica, and I've blended the two on a lot of occasions. So, yeah, that's kind of me. That's what I do. I don't actually consider myself any particular type of writer. I just write, and there seems to be an awful lot of erotica in what I write for some reason.
It's awesome.
Really? All right. Okay, I'll start with Nancy since we have you back now. Nancy, how did you begin the erotic horror part of your career?
I think one of the first things I did was from a really tiny publisher that I met back in the Genie days. That's how old I am. And he put out these little publications. His name was Stan Tao. And he did a couple of oddball kind of publications that had to do with sex and horror. And so I wrote a few things for him. And then through him, I ended up meeting, ultimately, the publisher of Masquerade Books in New York City, which was it's kind of I guess you'd say imprint, if there is such a thing, it was an imprint of a very large erotic center for magazines and all that sort of thing. I mean, it was a really big deal publishing house, and they decided to do some books. So I was very into vampires all along, and I proposed the first of my Darker Passions books, which are basically pastiches of the horror classics, and they're meant to be funny, and they're meant to be really hot, and they're very wild and extreme, and they're not tame, and they're not Harlequin romances at all. They're just over-the-top madness. So I proposed that to him, and he was driving down to Virginia or someplace from New York with his then girlfriend, who he ended up marrying, and she read it to him aloud, the first part of the book that I had written, and so he came back from Virginia and said yes, he wanted to buy that. So the name was changed, and essentially I ended up doing the Darker Passion series, which included pretty much all of the horror classics, Dracula, Frankenstein, Jekyll, Hyde, and so on. So that's really how I kind of strongly slotted into the whole horror connection to erotica. Before that, I had done those little stories for that person I mentioned, and they weren't particularly horror. They were kind of horrific if you looked at them in a certain way, as many things can be looked at. But out of that, that came a pen name for me, Amarantha Night, mainly because I already had a novel with pocketbooks, and they insisted that I couldn't write anything else for anyone else in the way of novels with my name. So I toyed with the idea of doing, N. Kilpatrick or Nancy K. or something, but then I thought, oh, this series is so strange and so really beyond the beyond that I should have a name to go with it. So I came up with Amarantha Night for a lot of reasons, which I won't go into because it's a short show. And so from there, I did 5 anthologies of erotic horror stories back then as well, same publisher. So I edited as well. And then I started doing other erotica for other publishers. And I did some short stories, a whole bunch of short stories for different kinds of publishers. There was also I did some for, there was this, Sephera knows this, she was in here too, this publisher that, through a former agent of mine, this publisher that does the Vivid Girls on the internet, they were doing novels that had to do with the lives of the Vivid Girls. So we ended up doing novels that had to do with them and from their perspective, and something to do with horror and erotica. And so I took another name for that, and also did a book for Orion in the UK that did a erotic horror series. Their imprint was called Neon. So I had a second name, which was Desiree Knight, who was the younger sister of Amarantha Knight. And so it just kind of evolved. It's not that I started out to do this, and I didn't do it intentionally. And I wish I'd heard what Megan had to say about this, but gosh, I wasn't here at that point. I was somewhere trying to get my computer to work. But yeah, that was me. That's how I kind of fell into it, I suppose you'd say, or it was already in my radar, but not quite in the way that I ended up doing it.
Yeah, I spoken a tiny bit about how you did the Sex Macabre anthology, because that's how I had my first professional erotic horror sale, was to you as Amarantha Night with my little lesbian ghost story. And then, yeah, we had some parallel publishing because, like you mentioned, the Vivid video books. I did 2 of those, and they were supposed to give me a pen name, but they used my real name. Actually, they didn't use any of our names, did they? They used the porn star.
Only in the, I think the copyright was.
Yeah,
was
the copyright page had a
hidden on page, the inner pages. You couldn't find it. But yeah, it was surprising our names weren't on the cover. But those books were done, at least the one I did. I was supposed to do 2, and I actually backed out of one. It just was enough for me. But they were from the perspective of the girl that was the vivid girl. So it was an I story. I did this, I did that. I guess they wanted to keep that illusion going by having it, having no one else's name on the cover. I don't know. I'm just guessing.
I didn't even get instructions, even though I spoke to the president of Vivid Video, and her parent was screaming in the background. And she didn't even know what these books were supposed to be. So one of my books, which was the Savannah Sampson one, I made both of my books horror. Were they even supposed to be horror? I don't know, but she asked a bunch of horror writers to do them, so that's what she got.
I don't remember there being anything like a guideline or anything like that. Yeah. Mine was horror too. It was called, the character I did was Mercedes with a Z at the end. Mercedes Book of the Dead, or Day of the Dead. She was from Mexico in real life, I guess, in Corpus Christi area, and so I had her going a little holiday into Mexico because she is, Latino. So she went down to Mexico and ran into a few, sexy ghosts and so on.
Yeah, I had a Savannah Sampson.
I feel like I'm just a couple of years behind you guys, and I'm like, that would have been so much fun. But
yeah, it was weird. That it sounds more fun than it was because it was so confusing because we had no instructions. So I had 2 porn stars. So the one I had her go through a fetish club and fuck everyone all the way in every room. By the time, the main character did. By the time he got to Savannah, I don't know how he still had energy left, but he fucked her too. And then on the other book I did, Sunrise Adams, that was another lesbian ghost story. But it was like Fantasy Island, but it was called the Lust Ranch. So people would go to the ranch and act out their fantasies, and meanwhile there's a lesbian ghost doing things. And then I also did a book with Orion with Nancy because she told me about it, so I got in on that one too. And mine was called Hungarian Rhapsody. And again, I made that erotic horror. It was a vampire story, even though I don't think it mattered if they were horror in that either, did it? I don't even remember anymore.
Supposed to be horror, I think, yeah.
Oh, okay, those ones were supposed to be horror, but
mine was.
Made the other ones horror, whether they wanted to or not. But Megan, I'm curious about your early career and how you got into writing romance and erotica, and how do you decide how much sex to put in, because it's a different kind of business than in straight horror, where in horror everybody hates sex, and if you have sex you're supposed to die. But in your world, where you play mostly, sex is a huge part of it, but you don't always get to talk about it, do you, or do you? How does it work?
Well, okay, so like listening to your stories, I think, again, I was just a couple years behind that sort of time when there were opportunities to do these erotic things. And then what happened was when I started publishing, like I had said earlier, I decided I wanted to write romance. Romance is, it was at the time, I think it still is the #1 selling genre. Romance novels are immensely popular.
Yep.
And so when I decided I wanted to focus my novel length work on writing romance from a professional perspective of what can I sell, I always wanted to leave the door open and write really sexy stories. But I came into the market in the early 2000s when erotic romance really became a thing separate from erotica and romance, or right, super sexy romance. So I kind of got in on the ground floor of this time when there were really sexy books that were erotica, and I wrote some of that. I wrote some stories for like Hustler and Letters magazine and those sorts of things, which were definitely erotica, veering toward porn, really. And then there was romance, and the doors were opening on romance where you could be more graphic and more specific, and the storylines were becoming more graphic. And there was this rise in the romance world where erotica, or really more sexually charged stories, were becoming more popular. And I'd always had an interest in that. I always really liked it. So that's what I kind of started writing and working on. And so my horror, even though I had always loved horror and I started off writing horror, there weren't as many opportunities. And like I said, I was like, man, that sounds like so much fun, you know, like these horror novels. And I had read, I mean, even on my keeper shelf to this day, right now, I'm turning around, I'm looking on my keeper shelf, and I Shudder at Your Touch, which was, and Shudder Again, which were two collections of specifically stories of sex and horror. I loved reading that and I wanted it, but in the romance world, you can't really go in the horror direction. So I veered more into the romance, erotic venue, and I was writing horror on the side and focusing on writing horror for myself and loving horror. And there really wasn't that much of a cross, other than I've just come to accept anything I write, just about anything I write, has a bit of an erotic tinge to it. That's just the voice I have. Those are the out. So I have worked mostly in not necessarily horror, although when I look back on a lot of my stories, and even if they're romances, there's a scary story, someone's had a paranormal experience, there's a haunting, something weird has happened to my people and they're all messed up. So that's where I'm coming in from.
Yeah, because I figured it'd be a bit different. But I will add, though, that even though it sounds like a lot of fun, those crazy books Nancy and I did, the minute they came out, the lines died and the publishers closed. So that was the end of that. So because I don't think there was much of a call for that.
That happens a lot. And so, you know, the thing is, like, I've also written for lines which, like, you write the story and then, oops, okay, well, that's it, because it's closed now. And you're like, okay, well, that was fun.
Yeah, because even like with Sam Hain, Megan and I were both in Sam Hain, and I know I was supposed to write some books for a new erotic horror line they were trying to put up, but I was very slow because I haven't been well the last few years, so I'm writing really slow. And so I didn't get my shit together in time. I wrote A Penny Saved, which was total erotic porn horror. You know, she literally goes to hell, you know, and all the reasons, whatever. But then there's supposed to be a whole series of those coming through, like A Stitch in Time and so on. But then Sam Hain died, so I never got to see where those stories might have gone. You know? But there's always the next publisher.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's funny, the whole thing of crossing over with sex. I mean, you know, there's a lot of times where there's sex in a book, but it's not necessarily considered erotic, although it is, if you know what I mean. Like in mainstream books I'm talking about, or even in any of the genres, there's often sex of some sort. Sometimes it's kind of, you know, vague or what is called vanilla sex, but sometimes it's just pretty wild and extreme. But it's there because sex is part of life, right?
Exactly. And that kind of leads me into the next question I kind of wanted to ask you guys. And we've kind of touched on it, but not really. We can explore it more like Nancy's just suggesting. How do you decide if you want your story to be erotic horror? How do you decide how much sex to put into it? Why not just horror or mystery or whatever, or just sex? You know, and again, like Megan has to, in the romance field, there's so many different imprints and genres. And like this imprint can have this much sex, this is not. But how do you decide? And you may have to think back to early in your careers for your decisions, because if you're like me now, we write what we are asked to write, and we don't have a lot of leeway just to sit down. I'm just going to write for fun, because I think we're all at the points in our careers where people ask us to write for certain lines or certain stories, and so we kind of know what we can do or not do because we've been in the game so long. But for a new writer, how would you suggest to them to decide how much sex to put into a story, and how does it make it erotic, or how does it I personally think there's not much difference between erotica and porn, but that's just me. But how do you decide, like, what's, you know, how to do that?
You know, I think if you're writing to a specific market, you know, especially if you're a new writer, you're going to be looking at the market guides and you see, oh, there's a magazine or there's an anthology and they're open and I could write something for them. That market kind of tells you what they want. They tell you what they're looking for, and so your story comes to that particular theme. And because you're writing to a particular theme, you're focused on that, but you also have a plot to your story. So your plot might call for something erotic in it, or it might not. It depends on the writer. But I don't know about the idea of determining. This is alien to me. I'll tell you, just right from the get-go, determining how much erotica to put into a story or not. It's not a way I think. So I just write based on what something feels. What I feel about it, you know, I feel a story and I write it, and if it comes out to be erotic, which it probably will have erotica in it because that's the way I tend to write, it just is. I don't see it as, oh, should I put more, should I put less, or what about this scene, should I make the, you know, I don't do it that way. So, but I think, you know, if you're a new writer, you're going to be writing for a market, basically, and the market, often the markets will say they want this, they don't want that, and, you know, you'll get a feel for it that way.
Okay. And Megan, do you want me to repeat the question? Do you know what?
Yeah. I absolutely agree. If you're a new writer starting out, you're going to be answering calls for story submissions, or you're going to be looking at publishers and what they're accepting and what their guidelines are. And, you know, if you want to sell, you will write to those guidelines. That's the thing is, for me, this is not a hobby. This is my job. So I want to do the best I can to write to whatever the guidelines are and the submissions are, or the submission guidelines are, so that I'm going to write what they want to buy. And I think that a lot of people get confused between writing sex versus what's erotic. You can have a story that's full of sex that's not erotic at all. You can have sex in a story. That doesn't make it erotic or erotica. It depends on how it's written. So when I look at stories that I'm writing, first of all, if I'm writing to a contract, then generally they've already asked me, like you said, they've already asked me for a specific kind of story. So I'm going to put in whatever amount of sex, graphic description, whatever is necessary for that kind of story. But if I'm writing a story that I just want to for fun, or because I love it, or because it has come to me and I'm writing it without being asked to write it, and I'm writing it hoping to sell it, I never start off with, well, this story is going to have 3 sex scenes, 2 of them kinky, and 1 slightly less so. I don't ever look at it like that. For me, the erotic content has to be really organic to the story. It has to, okay, some people think, especially when the erotica boom happened and erotic stories were flying off the shelves and everything was add sex, write erotic. Just throwing some sex in there doesn't make it erotic. It can have a lot of sex in it, but that doesn't mean that it's sexy. So I always look at it as, if I could take the sex out of this story, whether it's horror or romance or science fiction or fantasy or whatever I'm writing, if I could take this sex scene out, then I don't need to write it at all. Just like if I could take this action scene or this, you know, whatever kind of scene, if I can take it out, then it doesn't need to be there in the first place. So that's how I look at it. If I'm writing a specifically erotic story, all the plot lines, all the character motivations, all the threads of the story have an erotic component to them. If I'm writing a story that's, let's say, a horror story, there might still be some erotic scenes, but they're also really necessary, and they have to be there for whatever reason, you know, whatever the characters are doing, whatever. But one erotic scene doesn't make the whole story, doesn't make it erotica. I tend to writing more explicit or graphic scenes because that's what I like to read. So I write what I like to read. That's what I do.
Me too. I think Nancy does too.
Just thinking about how, I have this new series that I'm doing, and it's a vampire series, and there's a lot of sex in it. The book is called Revenge of the Vampire King. Now, the word revenge tells you a lot right there. And this is not going to be the pretty sex. It's not going to be romantic. It's going to be harsh, and it's going to be violent, because that's the way it is. They're vampires, You can't expect them to be, well, I guess you can if you've seen Twilight, but that's not what I do. So they're not sparkling, and they're not a good boyfriend. They're vampires, they're another species. And the word revenge says a lot. And I think people going into the book have to, cope with that, as it were, because it's part of this. It's the story. The story hinges on the revenge. The story hinges on getting back at, and if it's not there, then it has to be in a lot of ways. And if it's not in various ways, including sex, it's not going to happen as a story for me, because that's what I'm trying to write. So I don't know. I think, a story has calls for it or not. That's the way I see it. That's the way I've always seen it. I had an earlier series, the Power of the Blood series, that people always thought was very erotic. Again, some of the sex was violent and some of it was not, and there was a lot of dominance and submission in one of the books at least. So, I mean, this is, whatever people read into it. So I don't know. I'm not the reader. I'm the writer of this, the way I see it. And, I write what I want to write. And if people enjoy it and they want to read it, I'm really happy about that. But I know what I do is not for everybody. And I think anything that's erotic is going to run into an audience somewhere out there that's not going to appreciate it because of all kinds of things that we could discuss, ad nauseum. But those people should just stay away from those books then, and turn off the TV or don't go to that movie or whatever it is that's bothering them. There seems to be a whole theme these days to kind of, well, if I don't like it, you should stop doing it. Well, I, for one, am not going to stop doing what I do. And I don't think any of you two are either. So, this is just it's part of life. Like, get a grip.
Well, yeah, I mean, and just piggybacking on that. So in the romance world, in Romancelandia, like more sexually explicit books did become more popular and reached a real peak or a climax, if you will, in the last few years. But there are still people who don't like reading explicit books. They don't like explicit sex scenes, and they don't like explicit language. And my response always is, well, isn't it wonderful that there is a whole vast world of books out there, and we can all find something that we like? Read what you love. Read what you love. Read what and write what you love.
So I think you both have kind of already answered this, but what's your favorite part about writing erotic horror or erotica in general? Whoever wants to go first.
One time I was on this panel at a convention. God, this was years ago, and it was on erotic horror writing, and we got into talking about writing sex scenes. And somebody in the audience asked, and there was a row of us, and we were all women on this panel. I think there were about 7 or 8 women, and they started young, worked their way up to me. I'm always the oldest, right? So anyway. And Nancy Holder was sitting next to me, and then it went, down. So these women all started talking, and immediately, the question was, well, when you write these sex scenes, do you get hot? That's not exactly the wording, but that's what they want us to know. That's what this guy wanted us to know. Do you get hot when you're writing these sex scenes? And so all these women, one after the other, were saying, absolutely not, like it was some kind of crime or sin. I never would get, no, this is writing. This is a part for me. They do this whole thing. And then got to Nancy Holder, and she sort of, waffled a little bit. And she said, well, sometimes it's fun, and it feels kind of sexy. I said, of course I get hot. What's the point? If I'm not getting off on it, why am I doing it? It's not a head thing. Sex is not a head thing. I mean, it can be. You can play head games, of course, but the head games lead to something that's very physical. And when you're writing this stuff, of course I think you should have this. You should be tingling yourself with it. It should be exciting, because then you can write that excitement into the scenes.
I agree that if I'm writing something and I'm not at least able to understand why someone would get off on it, no reader's going to get off on it either. And writing romance, and specifically erotic romance, I get emails sometimes, and people are like, so I have to tell you that I read this book, and then this happened, and this happened. And it's a little bit too much information, to be honest, sometimes. But I always say, look, if I'm writing horror, I want to scare you. If I'm writing sex, I want to turn you on. If I'm writing horror and sex, I want to turn you on while I'm scaring you. That's the point of it. And I think that you can't really talk about writing sex without someone asking you. So is this what you do? Have you done everything you've written about? I'm like, yes, I've eviscerated my partner and eaten his entrails. And it was like a real turning point in our relationship, because after that, I couldn't get rid of him. Like, But at the same time, when I write scenes that are sad or heartbreaking, sometimes I cry.
Yep. Yeah, of course.
Absolutely.
We want to evoke emotion, and I think the highest compliment that any reader can tell me is that you made me cry, or you made me get turned on, or you scared me. You made me turn the lights on because I was so creeped out. Whatever it is, that's the highest compliment.
Absolutely.
Yeah, isn't that what Franz Kafka said? Something about, I'm paraphrasing here, something about writing is the axe that breaks up the frozen sea within.
Oh.
Oh.
Wow.
That was paraphrased. That's not his wonderful wording. It's mine.
Yes, I'm just made of ice.
Oh, you know what I mean. I mean, when people reading for a reason, part of it's entertainment, of course, but, they're also reading for some, we're all human. We're all trying to figure out what the hell this is, how we got here, where we're going, and all that stuff, and knowing about death is not the easiest thing for human beings. So everybody's trying to understand what life is about, how to live it, how to cope with it, how to cope with death, how to cope with birth, how to cope with everything. So writing also does that for you, and it should theoretically take you to some place that you didn't expect to go, and maybe open you up in some way. That would be really good writing to move a reader to that.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I'd like to just address a couple of little writing tips. I know we're almost at the end here, but now we all, erotica, whether it's horror or fantasy or science fiction or whatever, we live in 2017 where there's specific ideas about sex and such. How do you guys handle safe sex and birth control, or do you? Does it matter? I know I'm sure... specific imprints have specific rules, because I know I did when I'm doing my, well, it used to be Ravenous Romance, but now it's Riverdale Avenue books. And for me, I just kind of say, well, this is a fantasy, so you can pretend they're using condoms or not. It's up to you. But how do you guys deal with it? Or do you like show them putting on the condom every time, or, checking the pregnancy stick and all that stuff? Or,
I'll jump in if it's okay. So it depends on what I'm writing. If I'm writing a romance, especially a contemporary romance that doesn't have any fantasy or horror or any other kind of elements, I absolutely make sure that the reader knows that safe sex is being practiced. I don't specifically necessarily describe it, but absolutely either the characters have a conversation or there's, some description of birth control or something, because I think in a contemporary world, responsible adults make sure that they're safe. But in a horror or a fantasy, a dark fantasy, or especially any kind of historical flavored story, then I don't necessarily bring it up, because, okay, so what's scarier than having unprotected sex? Like, honestly, like, number one, you've had it and then you're super scared afterwards. So, I think that lends itself really well to some kind of a horror feeling. And generally, so if it's a romance, they have a conversation or it's mentioned, but not necessarily in specific detail. I assume the reader knows how it works. But if it's in horror or dark fantasy or something like that, a lot of times it's not mentioned. It's not necessarily a part of what's going on. So that's for me.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm writing vampires, so it just doesn't apply. but if you're writing a story that is a contemporary story, as you say, it's about people today and how they are, and it's a realistic approach to the situation. So it fits into that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yep, it absolutely does. I like that. What's more scary than having unprotected sex? That's a good one. Okay, so... Pardon?
Well, I like to say a lot that, people say, oh, you write romance and you write horror. And I say, well, they're pretty much the same because there's usually a lot of screaming and a lot of flicks. So it's also scarier than falling in love. I mean, that's the most scariest thing that anybody ever does ever. So there are a lot of parallels.
And orgasm is called little death, right? So, I don't know.
And when people say, oh, you shouldn't have sex in horror, my goodness, oh, no, I don't want to, I don't get your chocolate in my peanut butter. Don't get your sexy sex in my horror. Holy cow. Like, horror as a whole, that your adrenaline is going, your heart is pumping, you're sweating. I mean, horror and sex to me perfectly go hand in hand. There's nothing more perfectly paired than erotic and horror together.
That's how I've always felt, but I tell you, I and that was one of the things I was going to talk about next anyway, so here we are. I've had people write to me, how they hate horror with their sex, like you said, like the peanut butter and chocolate. It's like, no, I love Reese's peanut butter cups. They're my favorite, and so is erotic horror. And I'm just like, everybody has sex. Like, why wouldn't people in a horror story have sex? And just let's see. I was going to say here, just because people have sex in a horror story doesn't mean they have to die. Because they have all those slasher movies. You have sex, you're dead. You're dead because you had sex. But I think that's dumb. And yeah, and I've had great arguments with people at signings about. Why do you put sex in with horror? I would have liked your book if there was no sex in it. And I'm thinking the book wouldn't exist without sex, because sex, as you guys were talking earlier, it was an integral part of the plot. So I don't know what book you would have been reading. But yeah, like, do you guys have... How do you guys handle that when people bitch about the sex? Like,
you see, people don't bitch to me about the sex in my books, and some of it's pretty graphic and extreme.
Yeah,
and over the
totally extreme.
People don't bitch at me. They don't say anything.
You're afraid you're going to shackle them to something.
Right. Shut up and get in the corner. But basically, I don't have those kinds of reactions from readers. I don't know why, but I just assume that they're getting something out of the book, or they're not reading any more of the series that I do, and they'll go somewhere else, and they're not going to tell me. I don't know. I had a review. I had a couple of reviews for the book that I just did, Revenge of the Vampire King, and it's, like I said, it's full of very extreme sex. And the one reviewer ended up in the review saying, and I could tell because she mentioned the sex a few times, she ended up saying that this was a brave book. And I thought that was a really nice thing to say. I didn't think it was the nicest review ever, but, that at least, she understood what I was trying to do, even though it probably, almost knocked her off her chair. I got the feeling, it's very extreme. So, but that kind of reaction, I don't care. That's okay with me because she understood what the basis of this was. It's a brave thing in a world where there's an awful lot of people bullying other people, I guess you would say, in the name of political correctness. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I think there are certain things that definitely all people should have rights, and no one should be discriminated against because of their gender or their skin color or any of that. But there's a lot of people using the PC hammer to hammer other people over the head now, which I don't like very much. So I think, it's nice to be able to write something and just do it. And if people don't like it, they can go somewhere else.
Yeah, well, there are so many books for people to read, and I think the odd thing about adding sex is, like Sephera said, everyone has sex or wants to have sex. I mean, it's a very basic human need and drive. And so when you add it into a story, and as I said, I think that it always should be organic. There are plenty of stories that just throw in sex for the sake of it, and I don't know that they work so well. But what better way to connect people? How do people connect but falling in love or sex or sexual connection or whatever? And so, the basis of horror is this thing where you're going through something super scary, and how do you get out of it? You have a partner, or you have a sex interest, or you have this release, or there are so many reasons why sex, to me, works in horror, that erotic release works in horror, or how they are paired. And if you don't like it, read something else. There are lots of things that don't have sex in them,
Yeah.
Move on. Find something that works for you, but it is a funny thing that sexual content in stories, I've had a lot of sort of comments or emails or whatever, where people are really affronted, not just, I read this and I didn't care for it, but also, you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't put this in there because I don't like it.
Yeah.
Amazing. It's amazing people have that hubris.
Yeah. And when I was in elementary school, when they aired the Frank Langella the Frank Langella version of Dracula aired on television, and it was the thing where your parents let you stay up and watch it or whatever. Recently, I just was gifted with a DVD for my birthday, a DVD version of it, and I hadn't seen it in years. It was still as sexy. And watching it, oh, so that's why I am the way I am. I can totally trace back my womanhood and a lot of the themes that I write about to that version of Dracula, where he was so sexy and he had that amazing 70s hair with the flipped hair and so hot. Still so hot.
Yeah, he is.
It's a really central thing. I think that has a lot of connection with people, and you either get it and like it, or you don't.
Well, my vampire of choice was Christopher Lee. His autobiography was called Tall, Dark, and Gruesome.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's funny. It is very personal because a lot of people were very, attracted to him as a person, attracted to him as a man. You could see it with a lot of the fans, but also for that particular character because of just the way the character was. I remember going to this, actually when I lived in Toronto, I went to this bar on Spadina Avenue that used to show movies. There was some guy there, somebody who used to show these old movies.
Hey, maybe he's related to Megan.
So I went there to see Horror of Dracula, which I hadn't seen in years. And the room was full of, not so many goths, because I was one of the goth elements, but more punk kids. And every one of those scenes where Dracula came on and he was really, hot and sexy in the way of the times when it was made, they went hysterical with laughter. They just thought it was the funniest thing. So it's all, whatever works for you. That didn't work for them. It worked for me. I was shocked, though.
But it's generational, too, though, because I know, things that used to horrify me as a kid, kids today would laugh at, it's just what you're exposed to. And
because Bela Lugosi was the big deal in the 30s, right? He was the one that all the women swooned over.
Yeah,
exactly. And I guess then, too.
Yeah, well, and I think that, just in general, what you're exposed to or what sort of resonates with you as generationally or, however, so there was a time when women weren't allowed to express their sexuality. So the only way they really could would be if someone came along and crept in their room at night and sucked their necks.
And other things.
So
The vampire. The Victorian novel. That's exactly it. That's who he was. He was a upper crust, guy, and he crept into the bedrooms of the upper crust women at night and sucked their blood. And then he felt guilty about it, of course. And he threw himself into Mount Vesuvius at the end after 2,000 pages. It was long.
I think there's a reason why vampires are still, everyone says, oh, vampires, they're out. They're not popular anymore. Vampires are super sexy. They're always going to be popular.
Oh, yes. They're about to have a new run, too, because, Anne Rice has got the TV show coming on there. Her son, Chris, is also working with, based on Vampire Lestat and her novels.
Yeah.
So it's another, resurgence, another resurrection for the vampire.
The eternal resurrection.
I think there's a lot of sexuality that's intertwined with horror and shame and the ideals of what is appropriate or not, and how, it's all connected. But that's a whole other, that's another 2 or 3 hours worth of discussion.
It is.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so one more kind of thing to get through. I know we're running late here. Okay, so these days I'm finding it difficult to write horror for many reasons. I'm finding technology is making it challenging. I'm finding political and social climate challenging. And the way I wrote in the 90s isn't going to work these days. Where we used to have fantasies about being seduced, as we were just talking about with Dracula, now many people would call that rape. I just saw Beauty and the Beast last week, the live-action version. There was a lot of fuss before the movie came out that there was a gay character. And yet, my own mind kept going to, isn't this a story about bestiality? Shouldn't we be a little more concerned about a girl falling in love with an animal and be encouraged to love him by talking candles and teapots? Is this a beast? This is a bestiality story. After all, she has to fall in love with him as the beast for the spell to be broken. But there seems to be a special spot for werewolves, vampires, and zombies and other not humans. And I'm not exactly sure what I'm asking, but I guess in a roundabout way, I'm asking how far is too far, and are there places you won't go in your erotica?
Okay, I'll jump in again. So I think that I love zombies so much. I've written a number of zombie stories. Love them. Even ventured into zombie erotica in my, it was a serial, but now it's published as one whole piece. It's called The Resurrected. So there is a zombie love scene, but it's so gross. It's super disgusting. It's gross. Like basically, they eat each other, which I don't know is kind of the sexiest thing you could do to your partner. I don't know. But I think so. Zombies for me are like, that's a tricky thing. But vampires, so hot, always so hot. And werewolves, again, depending on how you do it. So there's that part where is he a guy or a girl? Or are they an animal? For me personally, bestiality is crossing the line. That's where I ended. I would not do the love scene in animal form for either partner. That's my line.
So, but it would be okay, like after Beauty and the Beast, and the spoiler alert, she falls in love with him, and he becomes the prince again. So when they go off and have sex later on, that's okay because he's not the Beast anymore.
Maybe
would it never be okay because he was a beast once?
Won't she be bored? If he was so hot when he was...
She had a huge library. She liked all those books.
So library, good.
Probably a lot of porn in that library. No.
Nothing to do in the castle at night by candlelight.
I know.
If she falls in love with him in that form, but he becomes something else. Well, okay, like we're not supposed to be shallow, right? Like he's hotter than the prince or whatever, but she fell in love with him in this bestial form. And then he changes back. He's not the man that she fell in love with.
That's exactly right.
No, I know. It's so difficult to decide. Like, that's whole story. I've never liked that story. It doesn't make sense to me. But.
Well, I haven't seen the movie. I can't say anything about it, but I absolutely hated the poster. I hated it because what's her name? The girl, the woman that's in it.
So
Looks like
cast. She is no friggin'
Pearl.
That's sure. It's
Yeah, I mean, in the picture, she looks like she's 15, and he looks like this, typical sort of old man that's trying to seduce a child. So I don't know. That's supposed to be.
Well, in this current version, the guy who plays the Beast, he's a young guy, and he's really cute.
I'm sure it's when you see the movie. I'm just talking about the poster.
She's kissing a beast. Like, it's an animal. Like, why are people mad about that? They're worried about, some guy's hero worshipping the, asshole. And, they say it's a gay subplot, but, if you see the movie, it's like no gayer than any other, in my view, because, there's always the idol worship, and he's more of an idol worshiper, and he dances with the man at the end. So what? Like, to me, that's nothing, but of course, but
the things I wouldn't write they have to do with animals and they have to do with children. When I say children, I mean young children up to say the age of 16 or 17, anybody under that age, because I don't feel that children and certainly animals do not have a choice in this. They're not making a decision. They're not having a choice. They're being taken advantage of in sexuality. So that's not for me. It doesn't turn me on. It just makes me usually really angry. So, that would be my limits, I suppose.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think in general, I love vampires. I love werewolves, but almost in horror as the monster versus the romantic lead. Right. Although vampires, okay, I already admitted that, at age 10, like I was totally swooning over Frank Langella, but, as the scary thing, not necessarily the sexy, long-term partner. I love werewolves kind of as the monster versus the sexy hero. And I don't know if it's because of the bestiality aspect of that or just that werewolves are scary and this dude becomes a wolf or this chick becomes a wolf and then all of a sudden, holy crap, that's the ultimate. I think it's an analogy for the worst unprotected sex you've ever had.
That could be.
Like, holy crap, I did it with this person and now they're going to eat off my face. Oh no.
And am I going to give birth to puppies?
Yes. So I think there's a whole lot of layers with that sort of thing. But, I don't know if it's the bestiality thing or just, I don't know. I don't know about that. I'll have to have some introspection and get back to you.
Yeah. And do you guys, just quickly, do you guys think, because, in these modern times, in some of my books now, I've read things where people are accusing me of having rape scenes and stuff, whereas, 10 years ago, they were just seduction and a nice fantasy. Are you guys finding different ways to write now, or are you just writing how you always did, and to hell with everyone, you're going to write what you're going to write, or are you conscious of these new societal ideas of, consent and permission? I have to admit, that's why I've been a little stuck on my next book. So it's like, they're witches and they're casting spells. So do they have free will? Am I raping them? Because they're, and I wrote a robot sex doll story, and it's like, does the robot have free will? And I'm getting myself all stressed out with these things because I read too much on Facebook, I guess. But do you guys have stress about these ideas about whether it's rape or fantasy or dark fantasy, or, you know what I mean? You know what I'm saying?
Oh, I think people are too serious today. I mean, anybody who's going to be a killer or, mass murder or something, they're not going to be affected by a novel. Come on, this is not how it works. They're just, sick and disturbed. So this has nothing to do with anything that's a problem. This is fantasy. Writing novels, this is a fictional world. It's invented. It's an imaginative world. It's meant to be, to some extent, greater or lesser metaphor. You're reading something that you pop into something else in a way in your brain. So don't take it so seriously. I mean, just go back and be entertained a little bit.
Okay. And Megan?
I think that So the idea of consent or not, it's very different writing horror versus, let's say, romance, where there is a real standard of what behavior or expectation readers have. And so I am aware of depending on what I'm writing, I am very aware of what I'm writing, how it crosses a line, whether there's active consent, whether it is stated. I don't write a lot of hardcore BDSM stuff, but that became, it used to be that BDSM literature was solely relegated to the erotica genre. It didn't cross into it certainly didn't cross into mainstream, much less romance. But the lines are blurred now, and so readers have an expectation that there's a conversation, at least between the two characters who are having this relationship, that there is consent, or that there is the expectation of consent in some way. So that can be tricky, because you want to write this. If you're writing erotic stuff, like, some of the hottest things are the things that people think cross lines. That's what makes it hot.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, so when you're writing a story, there's this really fine balance between, okay, do they have a written contract they both sign with a notary? Or do they talk about it like normal people, like generally people just talk about things beforehand. But even when you're even writing that sort of thing, there is this level of fantasy where people want to escape. I mean, that's why they read stuff. People read books to escape, and they want to be swept away. So there is this little bit of wiggle room where you can write stuff that maybe is either over the top, more than what people would regularly do, or super way less than what people would do. And I find that it can be a really gray area depending on what you're writing and what reader expectations are and what people think. And you can write the same story and have people screaming like, oh my God, that's a rape fantasy, versus, well, that was really, holy cow, they really went over the top. And I mean, did they really need to have the judge sign the order that said that it was okay that he put his, in her thing or whatever?
I think, you're right about that, like in life too, because I mean, sex really is a gray area in a lot of ways, and it's a dance. It really is a dance between two people, and you can't hammer out rules exactly for this. It's funny how people now want to have rules and regulations. I'm not advocating rape, so before anybody jumps down my throat, it really is a dance, and it's not predictable. It is a dangerous dance. Sex has always been a danger in some ways, because it's not so much a physical danger. It's more the danger of the heart. So there's something going on here that's very elaborate, and it's like filigree work. It's just it's delicate, and it can lead anywhere. You don't know what's going to happen, and it's a frightening thing, and it's an exciting thing. So I think that too much trying to make it this or that, or put it in black and white, takes all the charge out of it to me.
I think that's why erotica and horror work so well together, exactly as you just said. It's a dangerous thing. It is a dangerous thing to give yourself to someone else. Whether you are the Victorian virgin in the white gown offering your neck to the guy coming through your window, or you're a contemporary woman who's supposed to be all in charge of her sexuality and yet is willing to give up her heart to a guy who may or may not be a werewolf. You're not sure. I think that's why erotica and horror work so well together, because it is all about fear. It's about that base fear. And if we're lucky in our lives, we will fall in love and have that terror of giving ourselves to another person, but we will never worry about something really being in the basement coming up from the dark. If we're super lucky in all our lives, we'll fall in love, but we won't get killed by a ghost.
That's yay. All right. So, well, that's a great way to end this. And so why don't you two just give the listeners a little bit about your latest work and a website where people can find you, Megan, or any, where you are in social media, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So, Megan, you can start.
All right. Well, you can always find me at meganhart.com, MEGANHART. I'm also on Facebook. You can find my author page at readinbed.com. It's generally romance-oriented, but I do have a Megan Hart horror page, and I do cross-post. So if you are not into the romance stuff, but you like the scary stuff, you can find me there.
Fantastic. Nancy?
Well, I'm on Facebook. I have a Twitter. You can go to my website, and you can find any of my books there listed. It's just nancykilpatrick.com. And the new one, of course, it's the first of a series of 6 novels, and it's called Revenge of the Vampire King, and it's VAMPIR. It's an old spelling, an old word. Leave that E off. So you can find it on Amazon, and you can find it in the ebook or trade paperback or hardcover. Just look and buy.
Oh, Megan, did you have a book you wanted to plug?
A book that I wanted to plug. Well,
series or many books or anthology perhaps.
I want to plug an anthology project. It's called Intersections, 6 Tales of Ouija Horror. All 6 stories. I have one, and Sephera has one. All of them have the theme of having a Ouija board connection. And mine, I wouldn't say that it's erotic horror, but it definitely has an erotic scene in it. And when I was writing it, it was definitely, let's just say there's a lot of blood and oral.
I just bought it yesterday as an ebook.
Yay, we have a customer.
Well, it was fun when I was writing it. I was like, this is not something I could ever get away with in a romance for sure. But holy cow, horror, yeah!
Yeah, do what you want to do in horror. That's the fun thing about horror. All right. Well, thank you both very much for being part of the Great Lakes Horror Company podcast as presented by the Library of the Damned and our special Sex and Slaughter edition. Thank you very much, Nancy and Megan, and have a great night.
Welcome back. I am Jason White, and I am here with Lucy Taylor. Lucy is the author of 7 novels, including Dancing with Demons, Spree, Nailed, Saving Souls, Eternal Heart, and the Stoker Award-winning The Safety of Unknown Cities. Her stories have appeared in over 100 magazines and anthologies, including the Mammoth Book of Historical Erotica, The Best of Cemetery Dance, 20th Century Gothic, the year's best fantasy and horror, and the century's best horror fiction. Her most recent collection is Fatal Journeys, horror stories set in exotic lands, published by Overlook Connection Press, with an introduction by acclaimed horror author Jack Ketchum. Welcome to the show, Lucy.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Oh, as you could probably tell, I pretty much took that bio from your bio on the internet.
It sounded familiar.
It sounded a little familiar. But there's a lot of stuff I left out, and I did want to talk about that briefly. You also mentioned in your bio that you have a love for traveling, and from what I've read about you, you've been all over the world. So I was wondering, how has travel affected your writing, but not only in writing about location, but about the people who populate your stories?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, I have been fortunate to have been able to do a lot of traveling. Some of that was when I was writing nonfiction, and a lot of that was travel writing. And how has it influenced my horror writing? I think to the greatest degree, some years ago, I got in on the ground floor of a series of anthologies called Exotic Gothic, edited by Danelle Olson, and I was fortunate enough to be able to get stories in each of, I believe there were 5, actually, of Exotic Gothics. And so the premise of that, of course, was a Gothic horror story set in an exotic land. And my travel activities benefited me a great deal when it came to writing those stories. And as far as people, wow, that really is a good question. The only thing that springs immediately to mind, to be honest, the novel that you mentioned, The Safety of Unknown Cities, now this has nothing to do with people in foreign lands, but the way I got the title for that novel, I realized many, many years ago when I was traveling alone in Europe for the first time that I never feel as safe as when I am in an unknown city, where, of course, today, in today's world with connectivity that we have, it's a little bit different. But back in those days, I really could realize that basically nobody on the planet knew where I was. And I loved that feeling.
That would be an interesting feeling.
It gave me a great sense of freedom and of safety.
Yeah. Now, you also mentioned, and I quote, that you jogged with a troop of baboons in Zaire. Now,
I did.
That got my curiosity piqued. How exactly did that occur, and what was it like? Were you terrified?
Well, you're right. I probably should have been. Actually, now that I think of the way I phrased it, it sounds as if the baboons were going jogging and I went along. But what actually
you see them wearing their shorts and that, and the headbands.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like that. Not exactly. I was staying in Zimbabwe, and Zaire and Zimbabwe I was right next to the border, and I have been, until the last couple of years, and my knees are not as great as they once were, I have been kind of a lifelong jogger, and I've always loved jogging in foreign countries. So I'm very early in the morning one morning, and I just crossed the border into Zaire, and there was a troop of baboons, and they were running alongside of me. And yeah, the thought did cross my mind, these guys are supposed to be really dangerous. But I didn't think it would be smart to turn around and run in the other direction. No. So I just kept going, and they kept going, and all was well.
That's awesome. It's memories, like, that's one thing I love about traveling, is just experiencing different things like that. It really creates some special memories.
Oh, it does. The unexpected.
Yeah.
You really never know when something quite amazing or whimsical or who knows is going to occur.
Yeah. So
it's quite fun.
You've been writing for decades now, and
long time.
And
I
your first novel, you won the Bram Stoker for that. What was that like?
I did.
Winning for your first time.
Well, it was. Oh my gosh, it was wonderful. I was asked that not long ago, and I guess I had a little bit of a suspicion, because I had a friend who was very good friends with Harlan Ellison, and so Harlan had kind of called me up and said, you really don't want to miss World Horror Convention this year. And he said it in that way that I thought,
okay.
This sounds like really good news. So I wasn't entirely surprised, but of course still it was wonderful, and I'm always just very grateful that I had the opportunity and that it worked out that way.
Yeah.
That a lot of people seem to like the book.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine. I was just wondering if you found yourself intimidated at all by that, because it was your first novel and then you won the Stoker for it. Did it haunt you in any negative way in writing the second book?
I think you're right, and I didn't think about it at the time, although I have read that in different articles, subsequently, how that does happen to people, and I think it probably did, because I don't know. I didn't think The Safety of Unknown Cities was going to be that well received. Actually, it was originally a novella that I did for Stan Tal. I don't know if you ever encountered him. Probably that was before your time. I don't know, but he was an editor a long time back, and he published, I think it was Unnatural Acts and Other Stories, which was one of my first collections. And the novella, Safety of Unknown Cities, was in that collection. He suggested, why don't you turn it into a novel? So at that point, it was easier because I had already written the novella. But no, I didn't expect it to win a Stoker. That's certainly true. And I think it is a little intimidating. Definitely.
Yeah. Now you've been writing horror erotica pretty much the entirety of your fiction writing career. Is that correct?
I have. I think there were periods where I wrote more erotic horror than I currently do, but I still write erotic horror.
What is it that draws you to this subgenre?
Well, I like sex. I mean, come on, write what you enjoy, no? I like erotic horror, genuinely. It's I like horror, first of all, and I have since I was a kid because I like being scared, and I like the idea that there's so much more out there than what we realize. So there's that. And then you add the erotic component, and to me that just amps it up tremendously. Yeah. Because as a human being, of course, we've all got erotic impulses, and if you mix that in with fear or terror or whatever, it's just such an incredible cocktail of desire warring with fear, which I find very compelling.
That's interesting, because my next question was, what would you say is the connection between horror and erotica that makes the subgenre what it is? Because this is a fairly big subgenre within the horror genre. But I've always wondered, what's the correlation between sex and horror?
Well, I think they're very much inextricably linked and intertwined.
Yeah.
Even on a very basic level. You know, if you really think about it, I'm not sure if I can speak for men on this one. I'd have to think about it. But at least with male heroes, with male leads, you very seldom, that I can think of, have, what's the word I would want? It's an old-fashioned word, a milquetoast, a very unassuming, timid, placid man that the women are all running after. I don't know how often that happens in life. Maybe. I don't know. But usually there's some quality of ferocity, even if it's suppressed a little bit, in the male hero type. That if he's even if he's not an anti-hero, even if he's a good guy, he's still capable of some really extreme things. And I think that's very alluring. I think the same thing for women, that men must feel about women. If a woman is alluring enough to be really attractive and the guy really wants her, and yet there's that quality of he has some reason to think she may actually be dangerous, that makes it so much more potent. And one thing I would like to add, they did a study. I love to begin sentences with, they did a study. But they did. Some years back about fear and arousal, and they took some men and they got independently, each one, they didn't know it was a bunch of them doing it, they got the men to cross this bridge, this one of these string-type bridges that's very wobbly and rickety and looks like you may fall to your death at any moment.
Yeah.
And for a lot of the guys, they just crossed the bridge and that was the end of it. And for half the guys, they had a really attractive woman coming toward them and meet them in the center of that bridge. And afterwards, they did some tests and some questions. And the guys who met the really attractive woman, they rated the whole experience as much more significant and a much, I think I've told the story wrong, because I think half of the men crossed a bridge that wasn't scary. The important part was that the bridge was scary and they meet the beautiful woman. And they found her more, the more frightened they were, the more attractive they found her.
Yeah, interesting.
Even though she had no connection in and of herself to the scariness of the bridge.
That's fascinating.
And I think that's true. I think that's true, definitely. I felt that.
Do you think that there's a connection? Because I have a quote, and it's not a direct quote because I read it a long time ago, and I'm not too sure who said it either, but I'm pretty sure Graham Masterson said it. And he said that there's a correlation also between, like, I agree totally with what you say. That was very well said. But I also agree with what Graham Masterson said, and he said that there's a connection between the intimacy and horror the intimacy of sex and that fear, because you're kind of exposing yourself, and especially for like one night stands and whatnot. But we don't need to get into any of that. But but yeah, there is an intimacy issue.
Well, there is, and it's funny you would bring that up, because I was looking over a few books knowing I was going to be doing this interview with you, and there's an erotic horror collection called Of Devils and Deviants that I wrote an introduction to some years ago, and one of the points I made in the introduction, that sex and intimacy and vulnerability, it's that vulnerability and the letting go of the false self, I guess some might call it, that people really desire that and they really fear it.
That's true.
And so you've got the greater the intimacy, the greater the risk, really, whether it's the risk of being hideously rejected or hideously murdered. For many people, it's almost the same.
Then there's some people who get excited about the murder scenario. Well,
absolutely. It's like that roller coaster that you have every reason to think that the car's not going to jump the tracks, but we know they sometimes do, and people tend to jump the tracks a lot more frequently than roller coasters.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Yeah. It's that living dangerously, I guess, that makes you feel more alive.
Absolutely.
I was also in the actual technique of writing sex scenes. Mm-hmm. I've noticed that sometimes it's done very poorly and turns out rather silly. But I don't find that with anything of yours that I've read. So how do you approach writing effective erotica?
Oh, that's a good question, too. I think it depends on what kind of sex scene you're writing. I don't generally do anything that I think could be considered straight romance, but I'm sure some of my scenes have more of the romantic tinge maybe than others. And on the other hand, then there are hardcore S&M type scenes that I have written. And I think the biggest mistake I see in writing erotica, sometimes people may tend to approach it with a insert part A into slot B sort of attitude, that it's very much like that poor lover that we've all had, that is sort of like reading from the sex manual over your shoulder, and that doesn't go over well, either in real life or in writing.
That's true.
I think the idea is to get across whatever it is whatever kind of reaction you're trying to stimulate in the reader, find a way to do that, but don't hit them over the head with it. Don't make it clumsy, because then they might start laughing. You probably don't want that.
No, you don't want that. So it's one reason why I don't write sex or too much erotica, because it would either come out really awkward or it would just be too good and I would never finish it.
Well, that's a good answer.
That actually brings me how when you're writing erotica, especially like the more erotic scenes, do you dip into like fantasy very often? Like, what you fantasize about?
Oh, sure. To be perfectly honest, I think I use more. Well, in Safety of Unknown Cities, I borrowed very heavily from my own experiences. I made them a lot more psychopathic than my own experiences. But, of course. I'm going to tend to, I think most writers do, of course, I'm going to tend to write the kind of sex scenes that I enjoy, whether in fantasy or in real life, as opposed to, I'm not going to write something that, unless the plot for some reason calls for it, that I would find kind of ho-hum.
Yeah. Oh, recently you released your collection, Fatal Journeys. Now this is going back kind of to the traveling. But were there more themes that run throughout these stories than just traveling?
Well, gosh, I'm not sure. I would be tempted to say probably not, because there are very many different types of stories. Several of the stories are reprints from the Exotic Gothic collection, and several of them are never previously published. but and some I would have to say are not erotic at all. There's one, for example, The High and Mighty in Me. That's a story of a person searching for the serial killer of young boys in the Deep South.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, I hope people enjoyed that story, but it's certainly not really erotic. And then some of the stories, Summerland, I think, is the most erotic story in this book, and some people might disagree with me. But, yeah, I would say if you're looking for erotica and you pick up a copy of Fatal Journey, Summerland is the most erotic to me. But as far as a theme, I don't really think so. I think the theme is travel and the thrills, because travel, especially exotic travel, can be a lot like sex. It's highly desirable and it's kind of scary.
Awesome.
You're going into the unknown.
Yeah. How did you come to pick the stories that are in Fatal Journeys and, all the other collections? You have quite a few collections. How do you choose? Like, do you just come up with all these stories are about, different locations, so I'm going to create a traveling one. Is that how you do it, or is there other ways?
Well, I haven't really had a themed collection prior to Fatal Journeys, and I actually don't remember if this was my editor-publisher Dave Hinchberger's idea or if it was mine. It may have been Dave's idea that I had all these exotic travel stories, and maybe we should do a collection around that, because all of them, to one extent or another, all of them do involve travel. Most of them are more recently written stories. Now, there's one, I'm looking at the index as we speak, there's one, Going North, that is a very old story, but it was one of my favorite stories. So I suggested to Dave Hinchberger, how about including that one? And he said, yeah, let's do that. So it was just that I had an uncommon number of horror stories in exotic settings, and we thought it might be fun to do something with that.
Yeah. Before we go, I was wondering a couple more things. Are there any newer writers that you're excited about today that you're reading?
Oh, my. Well, there's so many wonderful writers that I'm excited about. As far as newer ones, I'm reluctant to say because I'm not sure. I know the old established ones that I like.
Yeah.
And the newer ones, I may not be real clear on how new exactly they are. I know that there's some wonderful writers that were published, I think, for the first time or close to the first time in Gamut, the online magazine Gamut, which is wonderful. So I know you could look for some wonderful rising stars in Gamut, and there's just so many, but I am hesitant to name a specific group because I might be talking about someone who's not as new as, they might be new to me, in other words, and not really be new. Well, I never can keep up with all the reading that I need to be doing.
Yeah, well, neither can I. I'm glad that you brought up Gamut, though, because that's a really stellar, solid piece of, a fiction magazine run by.
Yes, they're wonderful.
Yeah, and I love those guys. So, are you working on anything right now that you can talk about? Something that's coming out soon?
Well, I'm working on a novel, but it's set close to Gallup, New Mexico, but it's not coming out soon. The next thing I have coming out, though, are you familiar with Tor.com?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, okay.
You have a story out with them. One of their shorts.
Well, it's coming out. Actually, it's a novelette coming out on May 3rd.
Yes.
And it's called Sweetlings, and it's a science fiction horror novelette that's post-apocalyptic, and I really love post-apocalyptic horror, so I had a lot of fun writing Sweetlings.
Awesome. And that's coming out in
May?
So
look for that. That's actually May 3rd. It has a date.
Excellent.
May 3rd.
I'm gonna check that out because I have some similar interests in that. I just love that kind of stuff. So,
great. Then you may like this.
Oh, I probably will. So, where can listeners find you online?
Well, the best place to find, well, actually, that's not true. I was starting to say Great Jones Street, but I do want to mention Great Jones Street. They are an app, and I think they're wonderful, and I swear I'm not saying that because they've published a bunch of my stories, but it's a free app. All you do is go online and Google Great Jones Street and then download the app to your smartphone. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of stories, not just horror, but every genre you can imagine. You just go to that particular genre or that particular writer, and it's all free. If you've got 5 minutes, you're waiting for a bus or whatever, you can read some wonderful fiction. And the most recent thing I sold to Great Jones Street is flash fiction, erotic horror, called Lust in the Days of Demons.
Sweet.
So I don't know if that qualifies. That's not exactly online, but it's...
well, a lot of people have smartphones these
deal.
days, right? So that's really good.
So it's the same, essentially the same thing, yeah.
Yeah.
But because I use it if I'm waiting for a friend or waiting for an appointment or lying in bed not ready to go to sleep yet, you can just find. You talk about new writers. I've discovered all these wonderful writers that I don't think they're new, but they're new to me because I don't normally read outside the horror genre, to be honest. And this kind of exposes me to some really great writing that I wouldn't have otherwise discovered. So yeah, Great Jones Street. It's a really terrific app.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time out of your day to talk with us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Jason. It's been fun.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Hello, I'm here with Nancy Kilpatrick. Nancy has published 19 novels, over 220 short stories with 6 collections of her short fiction. She has also written comic books, a graphic novel, and has edited 15 anthologies. She is the author of The Gothic Bible and, most recently, Revenge of the Vampire King. Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me and the Great Lakes Horror Company, Nancy.
I'm delighted to be here, Jason. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, no problem. There's one thing, like, I've seen you a couple of times at conventions and whatnot, and one thing I've noticed is you have a very large cult following. Have you ever experienced anything negative or weird with any of your fans at all?
No.
That's a good thing.
When you say cult, it brings to mind certain oddness, but yeah, no, my fans they're readers, and I don't think readers in general are weird. Readers are good people.
No, well, you're right, but sometimes, things get a little maybe out of hand, I guess, and maybe somebody, might have the wrong impression, or, maybe somebody's a little unhinged. I always like people, writers like you who do have like a fairly large following like that. I always wonder about, any unhinged fans, but it's good that you don't have any. So.
Well, I didn't have any unhinged fans that I know of, or if they were unhinged, I didn't notice it.
Well, that's a good thing, yeah.
But I did have one experience that was writing. I wrote a book, co-wrote a book with John Bassenwaith for White Wolf Publishing back in the day, and it was called As One Dead. And I knew nothing about that world, nothing about role-playing. Mm-hmm. So I had to go to a session that was held at a club that no longer exists in Toronto, Savage Garden, and I went there. Basically looked at the game and how it was played. It was astounding to me because I'd never seen role-playing before. And talked to some of the storytellers, and they gave me the background on everything so I could write my part of it. But after that book came out and I would be places and signing books and whatever, the people that were into the White Wolf game, they would come up to me and they'd start talking to me as if I were playing the game. And they'd go into all of the... White Wolf has a lot of levels of characters, they're how close they are to, the origins and how, what groupings they're in, what sects they're in, and so on. And it's all, and then the personality of a particular character. It's a very multi-level world. So they would just start talking to me, and telling me who they were, in terms of this leveling. So I was still baffled by all of this a bit, and I just kind of nod a lot. And once in a while, I recognized it, something like Toreador. Oh yeah, I know what they are. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like being thrust into an entirely new country.
It is, and when you're a writer, you're writing. That's what you do. You're not necessarily what you're writing about.
Yeah. Speaking of writing, you've written a lot about vampires. I was wondering, what is it that draws you most to vampires?
I've always been into vampires since childhood, and I used to watch the Saturday night movies on TV, and the vampire ones were the faves. I don't know why. I guess maybe because they were the most human of all of the supernaturals. You could say in a way ghosts are human because they still look human, but they never quite appealed to me in the same way. Zombies, they're just a little bit too dirty and rugged and dead-brained for me. And it doesn't mean that I don't read those stories. I do read those stories and I do watch those films. It's not that. But in terms of what compelled me were the characters that were vampire characters, and even the werewolf never engaged me in the same way. So of the supernatural realm, it really was the vampire, because it's the whole idea that they were like us. And now they look like us and act like this, but they're not. So I always found that a compelling in terms of writing something, because it gives you a big range of creativity.
Yeah. Vampires are just fascinating creatures, I've always found anyway. And you wrote a lot, from my impression, in the 90s into about the mid-aughts under the name Amarantha Knight. And Desiree Knight, correct?
Yeah, I had two pen names that I used, and the Amarantha Knight, I wrote The Darker Passions is a series of 7 novels that were basically pastiches of horror classics, Dracula, Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, and so on. They were also very, 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 very erotic, extreme erotica, and they were fun to write because I was taking actual text from the originals. I was also using some dialogue from the originals, and certainly the characters from the originals, and trying to work in the scenes that were behind the scenes that you suspected, because when most of these books were written, it was of an era where they didn't talk about sex, so they weren't in the story, but you knew it was happening. You knew something was going on after it faded to black at the end of a particular chapter. So that's what I was writing those for, and they were wildly popular. I guess a lot of people really liked those. And then I did some anthologies as well. Early anthologies. I did 5 of those for the same publisher. They were themed. They were things like, one was vampires, one was Frankenstein type monsters, one was ghosts, demons, and I can't remember the other one, but it was kind of a generic one. So all of these, but this is back in the day. This was in the early 90s when there were a lot of writers that I knew from Genie, which was kind of like a Facebook without the visuals back then. And, it was easy enough to get people into these books. I had a lot of writers who's big name writers, like, Neil Gaiman was in there, and Nancy Collins, and gosh, it's hard to read. Nancy Holder had stories in there. Sephera Giron had a story. Who else? Brian Lumley had a story. Wow. It was, really easy. John Skip, these people were just there, and you'd ask them, and they'd say, sure. A lot of these people you can't get now because they're way too big, and they're, just don't have the time, especially if they're writing movies or whatever.
Yeah.
But back then it was easy enough. So each of those books has a whole pile of very famous people in them. It's funny.
Which is awesome. I've read some of those earlier ones, and looking back on them, it's just phenomenal. Like you say, those names, right? Like back then, like Neil Gaiman back then wasn't as big as he is now, but back. So you must feel a little bit of pride that you took part in finding them, I imagine.
It was, of the times. It was a bit looser back then in the early 90s. It wasn't quite as loose as the 80s, but we were still loose enough that things were easy enough. And it's not like it is today, which is a whole different world. But I think, people were very friendly and hung out together. I remember the very first World Horror Convention that I attended, which I think was maybe the 3rd one they did, I'm not sure, but a long time ago. And I remember just sitting there. I was nervous because I was, a young writer, and I was kind of sitting there looking at all this, I don't know anybody kind of thing, and watching Peter Straub and John Skip arm in arm almost walking in to have lunch together. And I thought, wow, that is so cool. There's two people that are so different in terms of their writing, and yet they hang out together. So this field is for me.
Yeah, exactly. I also love the Gothic Bible. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came into existence and what it is exactly for people who haven't read it?
Yeah, it's a nonfiction book that looks at the world of goth and the world. So it's not just centric to North America. I tried to pull in people from all over the place to get an overview of what goth was about at the time that I wrote it, which was this was in the late 90s. And the book, it was a book that my agent at the time came to me and said that a publisher was interested in doing this book. And because I was in the goth world, wanted to know if I'd be interested because I'd be a good person to write it. So I was interested, but that particular publisher had a different slant on it than I was interested in doing. The publisher, I talked to him and he told me he had a young child and he wanted something more like a warning against, goth, so that when his child grew a little bit older, they wouldn't get sucked into the subculture. That's not what I wanted to write. I wanted to write something that showed what goth was really about and present it as a realistic option. It wasn't a bunch of blood drinking maniacs going around killing people and sleeping in cemeteries. So that's how it came about. Then the agent took it to auction, but by that time we'd hit 9/11. It wasn't a very good time to sell a book because everybody in New York had gone into stun mode. But she did manage to sell it to St. Martin's, and so I wrote it for St. Martin's and had a good editor there who bought the book, who had been goth when he was younger, and he really liked the idea that I wanted to do. And so I wrote the book, and then he left, which happens in publishing, because he went to another department in the publishing house, and a new editor came along. And she was very young, but she didn't know anything really about goth. So she was, I think, a little bit intimidated by the whole thing, and by me, and by my agent, who was nonstop talker. We met in New York one time for lunch, the three of us, and God, anyway. So it came about, and I was really happy with the result of it. I interviewed something like 100 goths, and quite detailed interviews. And this was all through the internet, so that people, wrote back their answers. I got photos of people. It was really quite nice. Plus, I interviewed a lot of shops that catered to goth and magazines. Anybody that was participating in the goth world in some way, manic panic, hair color, you name it. It was anybody that could be in there. And writers, of course. I interviewed several writers and musicians and bands and on and on and on. So it's a very big, comprehensive book. Obviously, if I had had more time and I'd had some research help, I could have done maybe a bigger book even, or several books on this world. But I did what I could within the time frame and the little bit of money that came from it, because it was 9/11 and it was very hard to sell a book, period, back then. So anyway, I was happy with the results of it. And then at the last moment, when it first came out and got into my hands, my new young editor called me up to say that she had some bad news. The bad news was that because of 9/11 and because of things like Columbine that had happened not too long before that, Barnes & Noble in the States decided not to carry the book. Now, this is a death sentence to a book. You have to be in a major chain. And Amazon was there, but not what it is now. So it was a whole different world. Anyway, to cut to the chase, this young editor that I had, she actually really took after this, and she did a big proposal, a big presentation for Barnes & Noble. She worked herself to death to get this book into the Barnes & Noble stores. So they did end up taking copies for 2 stores only, one in New York, one in Los Angeles. And that was then. But virtually they relented, and then it was everywhere. So and it was So it was sort of a strange whole phenomenon that went around this book. But I think it's a good presentation of the goth world as I saw it then. I tried to base everything that I wrote on what people said in the very extensive interviews. So I was including what was part of coming into me, my own particular biases.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy reading, or have enjoyed reading that. Speaking of gothic and vampires, you've also written a lot of erotica and / horror, I guess you could say. One thing I'm always interested in is how do you think horror and erotica mix?
Well, I guess I don't really see erotica as anything special in a way. I mean, it's part of life to me. So if you have a horror story and you have somebody cooking, or you have a horror story and somebody's at their job working, I don't really see the sex as anything apart from a person's life or a character's life, or even a supernatural character's life. So to me, it fits in. I know people call it erotic horror, and I have called it erotic horror just for ease of understanding what something is about, that it does have sex in it. But I think that's part of the realm, especially with vampires. They've become overtly sexual in the last, 40 years or something. So they, and some of that has to do with films like the Hammer films that came out of the UK. Yeah. So the eroticism's there, from about the 60s onward, in that particular subgenre. And I just see it as part of it. It's just the way the world is.
Yeah. Revenge of the Vampire King is your latest book. This is the beginning of a new series. Is that correct?
It is. Yeah, there'll be 6, possibly 7 books.
Wow, that's a pretty that's a pretty long tale. I was wondering what was the genesis behind Revenge of the Vampire King?
This is a book that I wrote spontaneously in Florida, but I had been thinking about it for a number of years. It's been in my head to write this kind of book, and one year I happened to be in Florida for a month. It was unusual. Usually it was a week. But this year in the winter, that particular year, I was there a month. And while I was there, I had my computer with me, and I wanted to write something. I was happy to be away from Facebook and happy to be away from my home phone and, just to have the time to write and do nothing but. So I just started writing this book, and it came out of me fluidly. And it was about 100,000 words popped out of me over a month. So I had the first book. Of course, I've rewritten it many times since. And out of that book came the obvious idea for the second book, which will be out also this year. It's going to be called Sacrifice of the Hybrid Princess. And there's a third book and a fourth book. And I've been writing these over this long period of time. So basically, I have had the first book completed. I just need to needed to rewrite it a bit and rework it. The second book I had about 65,000 words done out of the 100,000. The third book I had 60,000 words. The fourth book I had 45,000. So these are all partly done, and so it's an exciting series to me. And each book can be read apart. So each one has a story that resolves within that time frame of that novel. But there is an overarching storyline as well. So if you read them all, you get the whole big picture and where it leads that particular big story.
Yeah. There's one scene actually, before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit about what Revenge of the Vampire King is about?
It's about revenge. There are 2 species in this book. One is the vampires, of course, and the other one is the human beings, which are called the sapiens in this book, as in Homo sapiens. And they are at odds, have been at odds for almost since the beginning of time. And they are enemies, and they are constantly warring. Vampires need blood, of course, to survive, and the sapiens don't like that. But the sapiens are actually, the vampires are pretty fierce and ferocious and violent, but the human beings, they are much worse in my viewpoint. They actually go further with things. So, and that to me is like my view of some of the aspects of humanity that I find pretty disheartening and disgusting. What you see, in the streets sometimes, and certainly what you see on the news, just terrible things that go on in the world. So I'm not painting human beings as the kind of, the answer, the be-all and the end-all answer to things. The human beings are shown for what they can do that's awful too. So
yeah, that was actually one theme I really enjoyed reading this book, because I just enjoyed how taking the idea of a monster and making them seem, despite their ferociousness, seem better than the human. Every once in a while you come across this kind of idea, and I think you did it brilliantly in this book.
Oh, thank you. I think basically what I'm trying to say is that they're vampires, and they've lived over centuries, many of them for a long, long time, and they have to have learned something over this time. And while they do hate the sapiens because of how they are, and I get into this somewhat in the book and in other books as well, that these were meant to be not enemies, but it didn't work out that way. The two species were not supposed to be enemies. The vampire would escort the sapiens, who are mortal, into their demise. And so it was kind of a leading in. Here, give me your hand, sort of like a Danse Macabre figure. Give me your hand, I will help you get to the next level, which is through the death channel. But it didn't work out that way. So what I'm trying to say is that, surely the vampires have figured something out over centuries. They're not as stupid as they used to be. And while they're not in love with the sapiens at all, as a species, they have tried to refine themselves, and they've had to band together and amalgamate because of the threats to their existence.
Yeah. One thing I really enjoyed was how you kind of turn the table, because when we're introduced to all the characters at the beginning, you get the impression that the vampires are evil and the humans are good. And there's a scene near the beginning where Morta, the vampire king, displays his dominance to the sapiens princess above a crowd of vampires. Now that was a pretty intense scene.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's what vampires are about. They're control freaks for sure. Human beings are too. But this is what the vampire is about. Anytime you read vampire literature, any of the books, I have like 2,500 in my library. They're all vampire books. These books, this is what the vampire is about, control. So it's not just what they're about, but they certainly want control. They want control, they like control, and they see human beings as inferior generally. Now, some vampires, of course, can be, melancholy, and some of them can be guilt-ridden and all of that. I'm not particularly writing those vampires, but, mostly they just, they see the human beings as food. Bottom line, they're food.
Yeah.
The way we see food.
No, this book takes place, you don't give a year or anything like that, but you get the impression it's around medieval times, maybe a bit before that. So I was wondering, what was the research like? I imagine there was a lot of history and sword fighting combat to look up.
Well, I have done other stories and other books where I've done research before, so I'm pretty clear on what kind of weaponry is what. But it's not defined because, partly it's not defined because when I initially wrote this book, I had many different genres fitting in there. I had science fiction, I had steampunk. There are a lot of things in there. And I had to remove I had to make it a reasonable length, 100,000 words. I had to remove things. I was doing too much because I was just having fun, right? I was just writing this to have fun. But to make it into something that people would want to read, I had to actually condense it and think more about what I was doing. So essentially, I removed things, and in the removal process, I decided that I wouldn't identify the era because I wasn't sure how I was going to present it in the future. Mm-hmm. And, what kind of weapons might be in the second book or the third book, or what, anything industrial that might appear. I wanted to be part of a world that could encompass whatever. Now, it has a medieval feel, probably because of the way the weaponry, as you said, but also maybe the way the sapiens are dressed. The sapiens have a very medieval kind of quality to them.
Yeah.
So it could be that. But I intentionally did not want to fix it in an era.
Yeah, well, at first I thought it was a complete fantasy story, sort of like like a Tolkien type thing, a dark fantasy of that type. But then there was a few references that were almost Earth-like, like I think you mentioned BC as in before Christ, and some things like that. And I was like, oh, this takes place, in our world. Except it's in its own universe because, of course, there's vampires. But and then, of course, there was the sword fights and the like you said, the clothes and the swords. So I just kind of put, two and two together. I imagine that other readers, though, will come out of it thinking, something else.
I think readers do, unless you hammer it down for them and say, okay, this is taking place in 1963 and this is what it was like then they, otherwise their imagination. Reading is an imaginative activity. You have to use your imagination. And I really always feel that it's good for the writer to let the reader have that space to imagine things and not be, channeling them so severely that they, personally, I like that as a reader, to be able to envision something, and then sometimes I've heard authors talk about their work and it's not what they've envisioned, but that's okay, because when I read it, it's my book to read. Yeah. It's my world, my imagination. Exactly. So I like to give that to readers as well. I write a lot of things, certainly in short fiction. I've written a lot of things that are not defined time-wise at all. I really like that sense of, you read into it what you will.
Exactly. And, most art is up for interpretation, and the best art makes the reader or the person observing it participate somehow, and that's a great way of doing it right there.
Yeah, I think it works for art, for sure.
Yeah. So one thing I was wondering about, especially when you're writing a series such as this, you say it's going to be 6 or 7 books. Do you have an outline for the rest of the series? Like, where it's going to start, where it's going to end, and the story arcs in between? Or do you just kind of just have an idea in your head and keep going with it?
I have the overview definitely solidified in my head. I know what I'm doing with the 2 aspects of the overview. I know where it's going and why it's going there and how it's going there. So that's kind of already defined, and that's, there are notes that I've written at the top of each book. This is that. So it's kind of like having a little bit of an outline that I always have at the top of a book, just notes for myself, so that when I'm writing it, it's just I'm clear on what's happening in terms of that overview. And of course, there's the story that happens within each novel. So that has to allow for that overview, but also be a story unto itself, so that it's leading to something, but it's also within that context it finishes, kind of. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, before we go, can you tell us where readers and listeners can find you online?
Oh, yeah, I'm everywhere. I'm on Facebook. You can find me there. I'm on Twitter as Nancy K. Writer, and I have a blog now, which I've just started whenever I have anything to say, which is not every day, but every once in a while I have something to say, so that's on the blog. I have a new website. So everything is there. I can be found quite easily, even in the phone book.
Excellent. Well, thanks for being on, and thanks for talking with me, Nancy.
Oh, thank you, Jason. I appreciate it.
And that concludes our Sex and Slaughter episode. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, be sure to check out the novels of Nancy Kilpatrick, Lucy Taylor, Megan Hart, and Sephera Giron. We want to thank all our guests for taking the time to chat scary, sexy stories with us. You can find the Great Lakes Horror Company on Facebook. Just search for us by name, and on Twitter at GL Horror Podcast. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a future show, please email us at glhc@horror-writers.ca. Join us next time. We have such sights to show you.